In the coming week, Russian President Vladimir Putin holds his annual press conference, and French President Emmanuel Macron holds a global climate summit in Paris. It's December 7th, 2017, and time for The World Next Week. I'm Bob McMahon.
And I'm Stuart Patrick, sitting in for Jim Lindsay.
Those who listen to the podcast will know Stuart's voice from previous guest hostings and special appearances. Stuart is CFR's Senior Fellow in Global Governance and Director of the International Institutions and Global Governance Program. Stuart, thanks for being with us.
Happy to be here.
Let's go to Paris.
Please.
All right. If only metaphorically. Emmanuel Macron is going to host what looks like over 50 world leaders at what's being called the One Planet Summit next week. This is a climate change conference. It had been originally planned in June after President Trump announced that the U.S. would pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. The United States is not going to be sending a representative to this conference at last report. So, Stuart, what's this summit going to look like? What's it going to do?
Well, I think it's mostly going to be a pep rally for the Paris Agreement. This is coming about 2 years after the Paris Accord, which obviously the United States signed, and then, as you said, President Trump pulled the United States out of in his Rose Garden press conference in early June. Immediately after that, in a statement and appearance that went viral, President Macron said that appealed to citizens everywhere, but particularly in France, but all around the world as well, to make the planet great again. And that became a very fast trending hashtag. And this is, I think...
And he's kept the lines open to Trump as well. I mean, he had the president come over for Bastille Day, and they seem to have a decent rapport.
No, they definitely do have a decent rapport. And there are certain areas in terms of some aspects of their views on economics that they actually see eye to eye on. And I think that he is holding out, Macron is holding out the possibility that at some stage that what was a decision that was highly debated within the administration, that conceivably Trump could come around in the future. He doesn't want to go out of his way to alienate the American president. But at the same time, he's making it clear that the show is going on. And so what we're going to see in Paris, basically, is the Élysée, the French presidential, the equivalent of the White House, in a sense, is saying that we should anticipate at least 10 big deliverables of some sort in terms of big policy announcements. But the crowd is going to be smaller than a UN General Assembly opening session where you have 190 leaders, either heads of state and government or foreign ministers. It'll probably be smaller than that, somewhere around 50 world leaders. But they include some important ones. And just in terms of heads of government, Theresa May in Britain, Mariano Rajoy of Spain. But in addition, Antonio Guterres, who's the UN Secretary General, Jim Young Kim, of course, the president of the World Bank, is going to be there. But in addition, the way that Macron is structuring this is with the recognition that, look, even if the United States isn't on board, many other countries are. But in addition, so much of the progress towards the Paris targets is going to depend on, in a lot of cases, subnational actors and also civil society and obviously private corporations.
Well, we
as
saw
well.
that a little bit at the meeting that took place last month, right, in Bonn, where you had actually U.S. local government officials, and you had people like Mike Bloomberg, who's been active on climate issues and so forth, taking part. So that seems to be the kind of a new flavor developing.
Absolutely. And, Michael Bloomberg has been, way back in 2012 in the Rio Summit on Sustainable Development, he formed an organization what was then called the C40 Coalition. And basically 40 of the largest cities in the world. He was, with his experience as mayor of New York, was in a great position to be able to say, look, a lot of the emissions are basically caused by cities. If the cities of the world get together, we can, make a major dent in this. And that organization continues to live on. And what he did when it was announced that basically the U.S. government wasn't really going to be occupying the U.S. pavilion in Bonn, because all of the countries have their own pavilions, he said, fine. He and a number of other private individuals basically underwrote this. So you had Jerry Brown over there, because, of course, California is taking the lead on this. So there's a recognition.
California, by the way, which is dealing with raging fires right now.
Right, indeed.
We should note another epic climate event.
Exactly, an epic climate event. The point is that in addition to national leaders, there are going to be a bunch of subnational leaders. There also are going to be a lot of celebrities, which is no big surprise. You've had people like Leonardo DiCaprio, who said he's going to be there, and former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. In addition, Bill Gates is going to be there and throwing his influence and presumably some money behind this effort to try to fight climate change. There's a bigger lesson here, though, as well, or bigger question here, which is about global leadership. For decades, we've had this view that when it comes to major global issues, the United States is going to be the country that has to lead. And if the United States doesn't, it creates this vacuum, and in a sense, collective action, international cooperation doesn't continue. The question now is that true? Are we actually going to see forward progress made? And if so, where's that leadership going to come from?
And it's a good point, Stuart. It's also worth noting, I guess, the Paris agreements, although said to be draconian by the Trump administration, in fact, were based on self-set up goals by countries. It was sort of the whole knack behind it was that countries would set up their own thresholds that they had to meet, and then do what they could to meet them, but not sort of set any standards that might be too strenuous to meet.
Right. Well, exactly. And there were different levels. The wonky term was independent, nationally determined contributions, or INDCs, basically. Right. And the reason that it was set up like that, as opposed to trying to come up with a treaty that was to be a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, was in part because there was a recognition that, look, we're not going to be able to get anything through the U.S. Senate. It's an actual treaty, a binding treaty. And also there still are big divisions between countries that consider themselves developing countries versus developed countries in terms of. But so the idea was, look, everybody come to the table with what they're going to do to try to reduce the emissions in their country and move towards clean energy technologies, et cetera. And the contributions and what was promised are significant. Unfortunately, it's only about a third of the emissions reductions that are actually required to keep within what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change considers a safe zone. It's also interesting that in the absence of American leadership, although U.S. is still largely on target to meet many of its commitments, in part because of the leadership of states and cities and also private sector corporations realizing
and
that
market forces too.
Right, exactly. Market forces. This is good business. Also, in corporate planning, they can't just say, "Oh, well, Donald Trump has let us off the hook." They have to take the long view and say, "Look, regulation is coming down the pike, whether it's cap and trade or other types of things." So we're actually going to start to move in that direction. But internationally, it has to be said, even though the Chinese will not be there in any major way in Paris for this particular, as I said, sort of a hortatory pep rally, if you will, they are moving ahead very, very strongly in meeting their commitments to basically cap the growth in their emissions by 2030. And they're moving really, really rapidly ahead in issues of clean technology, not least electric vehicles. And I think that they see this as an opportunity, or at least under Xi Jinping as a major economic opportunity to seize the lead in an area where the United States and others could, in principle, be leading innovation.
No, it's a really good point. And we just saw a report this past week that the head of Ford Motor Company was saying China is where it's at in terms of the auto market going forward and electric cars. It is all happening in China. So you can't raise that point enough because of the impact it's going to have, not only in the auto industry, but on carbon emissions and all other knock-on effects.
So, Bob, let's move on to another event that's slated to happen next week, and that is in Moscow in the Kremlin. Russian President Vladimir Putin is slated to deliver his big press conference, often a marathon event that goes a few hours. He's just publicly announced that he's going to seek a fourth term as the country's president this coming March, and those presidential terms are now 6 years, not just 4 years, so he's going to have quite a run if he wins this 6-year term. If he does, his 24-year tenure as the leader of the Russian government will be the longest since Joseph Stalin's 29 years. With the upcoming elections in Russia next March in mind, what do you think we can expect at this public appearance?
That's a good question, Stuart. I mean, Putin is really a person of the moment on the world stage, and there's a great deal for him to talk about, things that he can tout, but also things he can complain about. Let's talk about touting. He's already signaling a bit of a victory lap for Russia in terms of Syria policy. He said we've beaten ISIS. Russia played a big role there. And Russia's role in Syria marked its sort of reemergence, not only in the Middle East, but on the world stage in a number of ways. And so there's a great deal of importance in terms of Russia being able to consider itself a powerful world actor. And so Putin is very mindful of that. He's going to tout that. And we should also note, by the way, that he remains extremely popular. A lot of reputable figures, polling figures show him at about 80%. Now, you could also attribute that to the ways he's quashed dissent, and there's really no other major actor on the stage who comes anywhere close and won't come close in the presidential elections. But be that as it may, he's got the ability to tout Russia's role as sort of an influencer in all sorts of ways. But he's also, I'm sure, going to make no secret about Russia's displeasure with ongoing sanctions against it, over the seizure of Crimea and policy in Ukraine more generally, about Russia's getting a severe lashing by the International Olympic Committee over doping.
That's right. In that decision, they're allowed. Is it true? The athletes will be allowed to compete, but they can't do it under the Russian flag.
That's correct.
Will that be?
That's correct.
Okay.
It's a real blow to national pride. I mean, first of all, they hosted the Sochi Olympics,
right? Exactly.
And yet the reports that were accepted by IOC was that they were running an elaborate doping scheme to allow to make their athletes more competitive and win a number of medals, and they've had a number of them taken away. So you're going to have the Sochi the Olympics coming up in South Korea, kick off with some medal awarding to other athletes who were runners up and so forth in certain events in the Winter Olympics. So a real blow to the Russians. He will signal that, certainly. Russia has also recently designated a number of media, U.S. media included, as foreign agents, meaning entities that got reliant funding from foreign entities. And this includes Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and their various affiliates. And this is a way of Russia saying, we're not going to be kicked around. The same step was taken recently, or what seemed to be a similar step was made recently by the U.S. government against Russia Today, RT, just so basically raising the awareness that this is an organization that's not to be considered among independent media like, say, CNN or BBC or whatever, but in fact is as a foreign agent that should be watched as a propaganda, but not necessarily restraining its ability to report or do what it wants to do. I think Russia is being watched closely for what it does next, and the expectation is it's going to repress the ability of these organizations to report and also censor what they post online and so forth. So again, this is another kind of wary signal, and it's somewhat ironic, perhaps, the vehicle of a long press conference will be able to hear what President Putin has to say about his opinion of the press, and he tends to like to browbeat them, but also tease them on occasion at this particular annual event. And so it'll really be a sense to get a chance to see how Putin is regarding not only Russia but himself and sort of his next 6 years, which is seen as preordained. One other thing to note is that this would be, at the end of that term, would be the end of his constitutional ability to lead Russia in that role as president. It's not clear whether they might come up with some other guise for him to serve.
Right, exactly, or some alteration of the Constitution. It's interesting that he has an opponent or someone who would like to run against him in the form of Alexei Navalny, and who's been a major campaigner against corruption, and from reports appears to have a pretty strong ground game in terms of setting up offices.
He's one of the few, I
Russia.
think, that has a nationwide ground game, as you say, in terms of he's got organizers all across the country.
But it's interesting that, the Russian government appears to be putting roadblocks in the way of him actually being able to campaign. But in the form of, from what I gather, what Navalny considers sort of trumped up criminal charges of different sorts. But it's astonishing, really, Putin's ability to maintain his popularity and his approval rating, given that Russia's really been hit by a real decline in obviously fossil fuel prices, and then also and the declining value of the ruble, which obviously increases costs of all sorts of imported goods that Russians continue to depend upon. And yet it doesn't seem like he's paying a political price. Does he have a particular appeal in particular sectors of Russia, do you think, or is there a generational thing going on here?
Well, it's interesting to look at the way he announced his next presidential run. For example, he goes to a auto and truck factory, I think, in Nizhny Novgorod, and they kind of stage manage the whole appearance there and sort of, projecting Russian capabilities in manufacturing might, but also the lavish praise of workers. And basically, I think they teed up a question from workers saying, Mr. President, are you going to run again? And that's where he sort of announced his run. He has become very effective at stage managing the news. Many Russians rely on television for their news, and he has been very skillful at lining up allies, every level of government, in the business community, and in all important sectors. And there's a bit of what they call crony capitalism involved here that he has been, very skillful at managing, as well as managing Russia's ability to affect international events. And this gets into a whole other area, what I was mentioning before about its ability to sort of project itself on the world stage. That appeals to Russians. They like to have Russia, sort of at the table at big events and also showing its influence. This harkens back to its, obviously, during the Soviet period when it was one of two superpowers. And even with these other signals that you were mentioning in terms of weakening on the economic level, certainly energy prices, fossil fuel prices going down, Russia is still able to sort of play a somewhat weakening hand effectively, and the people respond to that.
It's really remarkable in the case of Syria, where, in a sense, the United States, when it comes to actually trying to get a solution to things, has actually ceded the field in a lot of respects to the peace talks that have been going on, being sponsored, I guess, by Russia, Iran, Turkey, I guess,
right.
in terms of and with in a sense the United States very much on the sidelines of those, and Russia continuing to determine the agenda, which, as you suggest, seems to be resonating quite a bit with everyday Russians. And also, of course, the media coverage is increasingly, one imagines Russians are getting their diet of media, for whatever it is, from an increasingly state-controlled or heavily state-influenced apparatus. So again, maybe not getting the diversity of viewpoints you would get in an open society, to
right.
say
So
the least.
we'll see how long this press conference goes. They've gone on sometimes multiple hours, whether it's 5 or 6 hours or whatever. How many sort of challenging questions he faces or how he chooses to answer those will be very interesting to see. And, it'll, again, give us a fresh chance to measure both how confident he's feeling, what kind of signals he may want to be sending to the United States and to the West. I would also note in relation to this, there's a new piece out in Foreign Affairs magazine, co-authored by Joe Biden, former vice president, basically saying Russia has mounted an assault on the foundations of Western democracy and sort of laying out a plan for how to counter it, and talking about, in particular, its attempts at manipulating the open media sources in the West, especially social media, to influence campaigns not just in the U.S. but across Western Europe, and has done remarkably well. So again, Russia is a force to be reckoned with for all sorts of reasons now, and you have in Vladimir Putin someone who has sort of unchallenged power right now, and it's worth watching very closely how he kind of handles himself and what signals he sends. Well, it's that time of the podcast, Stuart, for Figures of the Week. Who or what is your figure?
Well, my figure of the week is the French rocker Johnny Hallyday, who died this week at age 74. Is the voice of a nation in many ways. He's a crooner who captivated French audiences for nearly 5 decades. And he's interesting because he both gives off an American ethos, and he gave off an American ethos, but also was distinctly French in many ways. Well, he was born Jean-Philippe Smet, but he was inspired in 1957 by Elvis Presley to pick up a guitar, and French popular culture, it's safe to say, was never the same. He was a fixture in tabloids for maybe almost 3 generations of people, and he embedded rock and roll in French culture. Hard-partying sex symbol, sort of imagine a cross between Elvis and Johnny Depp in terms of destroying hotel rooms and things like this. Was married 4 times, made 2 suicide attempts, and throughout it all, the French just loved him. And what I find particularly fascinating is when you think about French culture, obviously, you tend to sort of think of the highbrow. It's a highbrow country where philosophers can become public intellectuals, but public intellectuals who are household names, right? But in the case of Johnny Hallyday, you got somebody who was appealed to, in a sense, the French common man as well, common man and common woman, and was a fixture of French society for a long time. And so it's probably almost as if Elvis just died in France this week.
It's a great choice, Stuart, and I think it points to the way, outside the U.S., sometimes we have a bit of a bubble here because so many other countries kind of look to U.S. popular culture. But for France, he was a really important figure. And yes, he had been dubbed the French Elvis, but really had his own persona, as you spelled out.
Very much so. And towards the end, he over 50 studio albums. And also fascinating, actually collaborated with, a number of some of the most famous rock stars of his age, from Jimi Hendrix to Peter Frampton. All it came to Nashville and recorded into some historic studios there. But yes, very French. And towards the end of his career, as many French singers do, sort of moved into the French chanson tradition, right, of the sort of Jacques Brel, or maybe if you think of women, Edith Piaf sort of direction, but was still selling albums quite late in his career. And in fact, in the year 2000, he put a concert on at the Eiffel Tower for 500,000 of his fans, and another 12 million of them watched on TV. So a major fixture in the life of France and international music generally. So, Bob, who's your figure of the week, or what's your figure of the week, I should say?
Well, Stuart, it's hard to get around this topic, and I'm going to choose the figure one as in one or the first or maybe the only for a while country that will have an embassy in Jerusalem in the coming years, and that is the United States announcement, President Trump's announcement this week that the U.S. is going to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And it created a huge amount of protests, certainly among Palestinians, among U.S. allies in the region, concerned about injecting new volatility into a region already roiling. But there were some supporters for it, certainly in the administration, and some other observers saying, look, it's as the president said, the U.S. is recognizing a fact, which is Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Every other state that decides to identify a capital is allowed to have that capital recognized internationally. Jerusalem has a lot of special caveats, however, obviously, as a place that houses the holiest sites of three major world religions, and also the fact that the status of Jerusalem is sort of baked into the peace process that the U.S. has been serving as main broker of between the Israelis and the Palestinians. There's a great deal of skepticism that the U.S. will be able to serve in that capacity for much longer. We'll have to see how things play out. We've already seen, as we were going to tape this podcast, strong reactions by Palestinians. I think Hamas in Gaza has called for a new intifada, although the Palestinian Authority, which runs the West Bank, is not committing to that sort of a response. So it's a huge development this week involving the ancient city of Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There has been some criticism, obviously, not surprisingly, from many in the Arab and the Muslim world, but also some allies. There's also been some criticism from sort of long-term Middle East hands who have sort of, for all of Donald Trump's vaunted negotiating reputation in terms of the art of the deal, that in a way, the question was raised, why give it away for free, if you will? Why not have it out there as, in a sense, a carrot to move towards a two-state solution? One thing that will be interesting to see is the degree to which the furor in response is confined to the Palestinians. One of the things, or spreads more broadly within the Middle East, obviously a major focal point of Middle East peace processes over decades has been this assumption that if we could only get that right, so much of the rest of the Middle East volatility would basically resolve itself or
and that's been challenged recently, though.
Indeed. And that has been challenged. And Richard Haas, our boss here at the Council on Foreign Relations, is fond of saying that the Middle East peace has gone from the top tier issue when it comes to politics in the Middle East to, maybe the third or fourth level issue. And so it'll be interesting to see, given all of the other rivalries between Shia and Sunni, between Iran and the Gulf states, et cetera, between, imploding countries around the region, whether or not there is enough whether not enough, but whether or not there will be significant attention within the wider region devoted to this particular issue itself. It'll also be interesting to see whether or not the president lives up to what he said in his statement, which is this by no means is suggesting that we're against a two-state solution. We continue to have that as the ultimate goal.
Which could include East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestine state.
Indeed. So it remains to be seen what the response will be and how much of a complicating factor it is. But it is possible that it will inject less volatility than, say, this same step being taken 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Yeah,
and we had mentioned earlier the situation playing out in Syria. That even though ISIS seems to be on the run, there is still an endgame in Syria that is fraught with all sorts of potential major problems. There's a major struggle between Iran and Israel developing in that area. There's recent Israeli strikes against Iranian positions there. There is a lot to play out in the Middle East, not to mention the Saudi moves, both internally and against Qatar, and the continuing disaster and crisis in Yemen.
Indeed. No, my assumption is that there will be future issues of the world next week that will include the Middle East pretty prominently.
Safe bet, Stuart. And that's our look at the world next week. Stuart, thanks for joining us this week.
It's great to be here.
Here's some other stories to keep an eye on. The formal awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize takes place in Oslo, and the UN marks the International Anti-Corruption Day. Let us know how you feel about the world next week, or tweet us your figure of the week at CFR_org using hashtag TWNW. Also, be sure to subscribe to The World Next Week on iTunes. Please note that opinions expressed on The World Next Week are solely those of the hosts or our guests not of CFR, which takes no institutional positions. Today's program was produced by Audrey Bowler, with senior producer Jeremy Sherlick and Kevin Lizarazo. This week, our recording engineer was John Fletcher. Our theme music is provided by Miguel Herrero and licensed under Creative Commons. This is Bob McMahon saying so long.